Welcome to the Transforming Trauma Podcast, a complex trauma podcast through the NARM Training Institute. My name is Sarah Buino, and I'm so excited to be sharing today's interview with you. Hi, Transforming Trauma listeners. The NARM Training Institute has a very special announcement. We are offering the Level 2 NARM Therapist Training online for the very first time. For anyone who may have been waiting for NARM training to come to your city or country, the wait is over. You can join us online starting in January 2021 for this NARM therapist training for mental health professionals working with complex trauma. The trauma field is evolving so quickly. This online training is an exciting opportunity to receive advanced, specialized training in addressing attachment, relational, developmental, and cultural and intergenerational trauma. For more information and to register, please visit www.narmtraining.com/level2online. We look forward to you joining our growing international NARM community and are inspired to work with you to bring NARM to your clients and communities in order to transform trauma. Let me tell you about today's guest, Daniel Shaw. Daniel Shaw, LCSW, is a psychoanalyst in private practice in New York City and Nyack, New York. He's also faculty and supervisor at the National Institute for Psychotherapies in New York. His papers have appeared in Psychoanalytic Inquiry, Contemporary Psychoanalysis, and Psychoanalytic Dialogues. His book, Traumatic Narcissism, Relational Systems of Subjugation, presents a way of understanding the traumatic impact of narcissism, developmentally and relationally. So please enjoy my interview with Daniel Shaw. Hello, Daniel Shaw. Welcome to Transforming Trauma.
Thank you. Nice to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Oh, absolutely. It's interesting. I was actually in a training this weekend, and your book was on the curriculum for what we were supposed to read for the training. And I was just like, we need to ask him to be on the podcast. So I'm so glad I reached out.
That's great. Thank you.
Yeah. So I'd love for you to start by telling folks more about who you are and your relationship with working with trauma.
Great. I'm Daniel Shaw, and I'm the author of the book Traumatic Narcissism, Relational Systems of Subjugation. And that book began as a shorter essay that I wrote when I finished my graduate degree in social work. Mm-hmm. And that essay was called Traumatic Abuse in Cults. Mm. When I began my social work degree, it coincided almost exactly with when I left a religious group after 13 years of very meaningful participation. And I left because I understood that I had been in a very abusive community led by an abusive leader. And there was no other way to think about it, I came to realize, other than as a cult. So I began, simultaneous to my graduate work in social work, to be studying not just psychoanalysis, psychotherapy, but also studying cults. And my study of cults led me to a study of narcissism, because that's how I identified the psychology of the leader. I saw the leader of the group I had been in as a highly narcissistic person who especially needed to inflate their own narcissism by controlling others. So out of that first essay, which was eventually published in the International Cultic Studies Journal, I finished my graduate degree and I went into psychoanalytic training. And at that time, that was in the mid-90s, there was not an emphasis yet on trauma and dissociation.
Right.
Although there was the beginning of that emphasis to some degree in the training, but it wasn't the main focus, right? Nevertheless, I already felt that I had a personal understanding of traumatic abuse from my own cult experience. And by the way, not really from my upbringing. I can say that honestly, but not that there weren't issues in my upbringing, but the abuse I had never really experienced until I was in that religious group. So, I began my psychoanalytic work as a private practitioner in New York, and I began to see all kinds of patients. Many of them were describing upbringings or relationships that very closely mirrored what I had experienced in the abusive cult. And so I began to think more broadly, not just about, the nature of this kind of narcissistic abuse in these cultic communities, but in relationships in general, in couples, among siblings, in families, developmentally, and in all kinds of other situations where there is authority and power, including in the therapeutic situation, which can also be an exploitative situation in some cases. Eventually, I guess I was in practice from around 94 until about 2012, when one of my mentors, Dr. Lewis Aaron, who's since passed away, just suggested that I write a book, and I knew right away that I wanted to write on the subject of traumatic narcissism. And I wanted to speak of that in terms of developmental relationships. I wanted to look at the psychology of the narcissist, because I feel like what we often see clinically in my work as a psychotherapist is that people who come to therapy can sometimes be labeled borderline or bipolar or in all kinds of ways. And what wasn't so clear in the psychoanalytic culture was a way of understanding these people as having been traumatized.
Right.
But I understood it that way. And I understood basically that this was when you saw somebody who was self-harming and emotionally out of control, I understood that this person had grown up in an abusive environment. And very often that abuse was at the hands of these highly narcissistic people. And, in my book, I tried to describe different relational contexts where this kind of narcissist and victim situation would occur. Because I was seeing it and hearing about it from the people I was working with, and that was far beyond just the smaller population of cult survivors that I had originally been studying.
Wonderful.
Right. Well, maybe I'll just explain a little bit what in particular I mean by traumatizing narcissist.
Yes.
I speak of the relational system of the traumatizing narcissist as a system of subjugation. So by that I mean that the kind of person, first let me say this, narcissism is a very common trait among most humans in some degree or other.
Right.
It often doesn't rise to the level of some kind of toxic or fully obnoxious or fully, harmful kind of behavior. Sometimes it's just that some people are a little more self-centered than others, or they're a little more self-referential, or perhaps a little more sensitive about their self-esteem and so on. Okay. I'm talking about a more extreme kind of narcissism where this person basically is a predator. And they have to have other people that they can control, and they control these people through belittling and intimidating and humiliating. They're initially quite seductive, and once they feel they have somebody hooked in, they then maintain a high degree of control over the person through this belittling, intimidating, humiliating. And this person basically becomes subjugated to the narcissist. So that person actually comes to believe that they are bad and the narcissist is good. And the reason the narcissist is cruel to them is because of their badness. So that is how I think of the relational system of the traumatizing narcissist. Right. And there's a lot of different aspects to understanding that behavior. But what I found was that when I was talking to people who had been in these abusive situations with these kinds of people, that they did not know how to stop blaming themselves or stop feeling alienated from themselves. Now, when my book came out, my patient population in my practice pretty quickly became more and more about people who had experienced this kind of real developmental trauma from narcissistic parents or narcissistic situations, right? And I realized I needed to know more about trauma and dissociation. And I set about, well, first of all, I studied with Philip Bromberg in New York, who's a psychoanalyst who specifically focused on trauma and dissociation. He's since passed away. The next thing I did was I took level 1 sensory motor psychotherapy, which was taught. Was taught. I was so lucky that it was taught by Janina Fisher, and I became familiar with Janina and her work. And I was really taken with the profound depth of understanding of trauma that she has developed over the course of a long career. And what a fine teacher she was. I also eventually studied EMDR and DBT, and I also did a lot of reading of internal family systems. And I found that I was able to integrate all of what I was learning into my psychotherapy practice. So I now think of myself as a psychoanalytically trained, trauma-oriented psychotherapist. And that is the population I work with every day. So I really had to open up to the world. There's an amazing world of trauma and dissociation studies that many of us in psychoanalytic training don't get exposed to. And I feel I've been very lucky to have that exposure.
Yeah, there's so much in there I want to dig into, but I actually want to rewind for a second because I forgot to ask you a really important question at the top. One of the things that we do in NARM in a session with a client, we would ask them what they want for themselves in that session that day. And so the question that we always ask our interviewees is, what do you want people to get out of this interview today? What would you like people to know about traumatic narcissism?
Right. Well, the people who most need to know about it are often the people that have long felt themselves kind of trapped in relationships where they constantly try to do better and work harder and be more what the other person wants. And they find it difficult to have a sense of their own self, of who they truly are, what they truly feel and think. And they come to depend on the narcissist for their self-esteem and for their self-regulation. And the problem is the narcissist is always trying to keep them destabilized, trying to keep them in a position of feeling unworthy, inadequate, and, needy, dependent. And what I wanted the therapy community to know, the professional mental health community to think about and understand, and what I want patients to understand is the same thing, that there is this particular type of narcissist who behaves across the board in absolutely these kind of routine ways, and that it's important to understand what's going on in the mind of that narcissistic traumatizer in order to help patients free themselves from those relationships, in order for therapists to help the patient, and in order for the patients to help themselves. So that's what I hope I can convey in our talk today and interest both therapists and patients in knowing more about.
What you have already shared and a lot of what you talk about in the book is really so aligned with how we view things in NARM. And NARM, we view everything from a trauma and relational perspective. And I can't remember. I think there's one therapist out there right now who's kind of blowing up in the field of working with narcissism. And I was actually talking with a colleague of mine, and because she had posted something on Facebook and it was very blaming of the narcissist completely, and it didn't hold for this trauma piece. And so I literally asked her, I'm like, does your way of thinking not believe that narcissism comes from trauma? And she said no. And I was just a little astounded by that because I think we believe that everything really develops out of trauma. I don't know if you have thoughts on that.
I do. I know that. I've heard that point of view as well. And I understand a traumatizing narcissist person to have been brought up in an extremely traumatizing environment, specifically around being made to feel ashamed of their dependency. Now, any human being is born fully dependent. And the narcissistic parent resents the child's dependency.
Yeah.
And the narcissistic parent shames the child for that dependency.
Mm-hmm.
Stop being so selfish. Stop being so self-centered. You're so needy. A child is fully dependent, and that dependency in a normal, healthy upbringing is recognized and honored and understood.
Right.
And supported, so that gradually a person's independence develops out of a
Right.
secure base of knowing that they have that dependence. They can always depend on a reliable, well-regulated parent who is also attuned and empathetic.
Mm-hmm.
But the narcissist is not brought up by that parent. The narcissist is brought up by the unattuned, unempathetic parent who is completely absorbed in their own needs and resents the needs and the dependency of that child.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that child brought up that way can grow up in a couple of different ways.
Mm-hmm.
But typically, one way is that they become a profoundly depressed person whose self-esteem is always falling apart.
Mm-hmm.
But the other possibility is that that person grows up to become like the parent, to become convinced that, that they're actually better and superior and everybody else is weak and needy
Mm-hmm.
and small.
Right.
And in order to maintain that illusion of how strong and superior and independent they are, in other words, they've been so shamed about dependency that now what they believe is that I don't need anybody or anything. I have everything I need because I'm perfect. I'm superior. But what they need is to have relationships with people who are fully dependent on them.
Mm-hmm.
So this kind of narcissist is disavowing and denying any kind of dependency, any kind of need, and associating that with shame. And the person that they choose to relate to has to carry that neediness and that shame for them.
Right.
Now, that's the basic dynamic that I feel is kind of, mind-blowing to people who might be hearing it for the first time.
Right.
And saying to themselves, you mean it's normal to be needy or dependent? And
Right.
I'm just feeling the shame that my abuser doesn't want to admit they feel, or
Mm-hmm.
it's a way that I hope to help people retrieve a faith in themselves that has been taken from them by the narcissistic abuser.
Right. And that's exactly the purpose of NARM, is really to support reconnecting to agency and not using that against themselves, essentially. Right.
Absolutely.
Mhm.
Absolutely. Now, the question of the traumatized person who becomes the narcissist, in most cases, that person does not want to look within. They do not want
Right.
to understand themselves. They don't want to acknowledge their trauma, or maybe they do, even while they go on to re-traumatize others in the same way they were.
Mm-hmm.
They are typically resistant to therapy and to that kind of self-exploration.
Except
And-
if they get pushed in through addiction. That's how I tend to work with those types of folks.
Well, that's a good
Yeah.
point. That's
Yeah.
a good point, because that might bring them to their knees in a way
Yes.
that forces them.
Yeah.
Another way is when they actually really invest in a relationship and
Mhm.
finally the person leaves them.
Yep.
And
Mhm.
and they may come to therapy at that point and start to be willing to look at the narcissistic behavior that has driven their partner away.
Yeah.
But in many cases, you don't get that kind of willingness from the narcissist. So when you're working with the
Right.
victim of the survivor of the narcissistic abuse, my goal is not to reach toward forgiveness, it's
Mhm.
to reach toward understanding. If I
Mhm.
understand the abuser, where they're coming from, what's going on inside of them, I don't have to love them, I don't have to forgive them, but
Mhm.
I don't have to take it out on myself.
Right.
I can liberate myself from the whole framework that they set me up for and put me in.
Yeah.
And I can see myself for who I am and see them for who they are.
Yeah.
So that's the goal of the work.
Absolutely. And when you talk about essentially the two different outcomes for being raised by a traumatic narcissist, one being the narcissist and then the other one blaming self, that also really aligns with what we talk about in NARM as either pride-based identifications or shame-based identifications. So
Right.
pride-based identifications is that denial that you're talking about, denial of the weakness, the dependency, whatever it is,
Right.
and denial of having a problem, versus the other side where you're over-identifying with the shame and the badness.
Very much. And,
Mhm.
you make me realize that I really want to emphasize the incredible fallacy around the idea that dependency is weak or
Right,
shameful or bad.
Yes.
Dependency is the human condition.
Mhm.
We are born completely dependent. And there's no reason on earth why a child should grow up ashamed of that dependency. Again, if that dependency is understood, welcomed, nurtured, if the safety and security is really developed in the relationship in the family, then that child has the foundation to develop their independence.
Right.
It's when the parents, these parents who are traumatically narcissistic, this goes back generations usually. It's intergenerational trauma.
Yep.
And they themselves have been made to feel ashamed of their dependency. They do not have a coherent narrative of their own developmental experience. And as a result, they repeat it with their own children.
Right.
It's tragic. But
Yes.
so often the survivors who come to therapy have spent a lifetime protecting the abuser and blaming themselves. And there's got to be a way to help them not flip it, but to understand more deeply their own humanity. And I think it's possible to understand and even have compassion for the abuser. But I want to emphasize, I personally do not ever push somebody toward forgiveness.
Right.
That's a very individual choice. And I know in some circles, forgiveness is seen as a necessary step for healing. I think of understanding as that necessary step. And if that leads to compassion, it might even lead to forgiveness, but that is not a given.
Yep. Yes, I think that's exactly our founder, Larry Heller, would probably say the exact same thing, that the aim is not compassion, but compassion often arises from the work and the understanding. Exactly.
And the one who needs compassion is the self, is the survivor.
Yes.
The survivor is so alienated from himself typically when they first come for help. They don't even hear themselves sometimes, how self-denigrating, self-deprecating, and self-blaming. And little by little, I work to try to raise the awareness of what part of them internally is giving them that message.
Right.
And where did that message come from? And what makes them believe that message? And, little by little, we discover that internalized identification with the abuser. And that's a very powerful moment in therapy, I find, because you have been abused by the person that you most depended on. Right. And what every human child will do, almost every human child in those circumstances, will be to explain what's happening as their own badness. So if I have a good parent and I'm the bad one, then I can tolerate this abuse because it's my fault. I can beat myself up. I can maybe keep trying harder and harder and harder. But if I'm being abused by a bad parent, what am I supposed to do as a totally dependent child?
Because it's a literal survival at that point.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Where am I supposed to go?
Right.
So that's how people become self-alienated, by explaining to themselves that they're being abused because of their own badness. And that to me is is the essence of all the therapeutic work that is done with survivors of this kind of trauma.
Well, and another thing to kind of go a little bit further with that you talk in the book that we also talk about in NARM is that as someone moves toward connection with their authentic aliveness, that's when they kind of bounce back and start blaming themselves even more. And in NARM, we talk about it as expansion, contraction, and connection and disconnection.
Well, exactly, because there's this idea of believing in your own goodness rather than constantly self-denigrating. It's not just an idea that you hear and, oh, that's a good idea, I'll do that now.
Yeah.
It takes such an enormous amount of work because the pull is always the pull is exactly that as the aliveness emerges, all the internal messages are, watch out. If you're alive and visible, you'll be beaten back down.
Yes, right.
So preemptively, just go ahead and beat yourself down before, or reverse yourself. You thought you were doing great. Well, convince yourself you're still just lousy. And this is a powerful internal pull, which again takes a lot of patience and takes a lot of persistence on the part of the survivors when they start to work on this. Yeah.
Yeah. And I feel like it can also be obvious, but subtle at the same time, because if I think about a client who, and even myself, who would like outwardly be like, oh, I hate my family, I hate my parents or whatever. But then there is still that desire to maintain that connection, that attachment relationship. It can just be like, you can almost start gaslighting yourself in that experience.
Yeah. Yes, very much. This is why I think people who have really experienced this pretty cumulative, complex PTSD, they really need to stay in therapy for a while. They really need to, for them to make that journey from I'm bad and it's all my fault to I am free and I know who I am and I'm good enough. Well, it's similar to the journey of the addict we mentioned earlier. Most people don't get sober and then just lickety-split, everything starts to just fall into place. Often they have slips, and often they need to remain in a community of understanding, supportive people for a number of years to help, not just to maintain that sobriety, but to keep moving towards a sense of purpose, agency, and basic goodness of the self.
Right. One other thing I was just thinking about that we were talking about in our training this weekend is the spectrum of narcissism, in that you've got what you're calling the traumatic narcissist on one, and then the covert narcissist on the other, which, as I'm understanding it, is essentially like the codependent, the martyr type, that everything is about them, but they're pretending that everything's about you. And I'm just curious if you have any thoughts on that, because I'm certain you've not just worked with people from traumatized narcissist families, but also the whole entire spectrum.
Right. Well, to be clear, most of my population are people that I would say have truly survived being the victim of the traumatizing narcissist. However, there are some people that I have worked with and I am currently working with who have recognized their own narcissistic abusiveness. So that's a smaller group to what I work with. Now, when I think of the covert narcissist, and there's certainly multiple ways we can think about that kind of person. What I often think of is that might be the parent who does nothing about the abuser parent.
Yes.
So there's the abuser parent, and then there's the parent who can't stop the abuse because of their codependence with the abuser, so that the child in that family is basically sacrificed. There's an abuser and there's a bystander who does not help.
Right.
We often see that as the father abuser and the mother bystander, but it's not gender specific. That can go all in any direction. So that covert narcissist, I think in terms of the system, the family system, is often the one who has not protected the children from the
Yeah.
abuse.
No, that's a really great way to put that. And as you were talking, that made me think of another question that I was curious about. If we look at stereotypical families in America, the mother is generally the primary caregiver, right? And the father essentially, whatever. But I'm curious if you've seen a difference when the mother is the traumatic narcissist versus when the father is. You're shaking your head, yes?
Well, it's not always different, but I'll say this, that the maternal role is the initial point of entrance into being human, right? Usually. And when it's the mother that is the traumatizing narcissist, I see a couple of things. For some women, what I see is that they become obsessed with what their mother didn't give them. And their despair and their depression and their self-harming is all centered around, why didn't my mother love me? And when I've seen the traumatizing narcissist's mother with a male patient, what I've seen is that man now goes into relationships with women where he doesn't know how much he resents women. He caters to the woman. He tries to give her everything she wants. He doesn't want anything for himself. And in the end, he's unwittingly punishing women in his relationships. So that's just a small, obviously that doesn't cover all cases.
Right, obviously, yeah.
But those daughters who felt unloved by the mother and who can never get over wanting the mother's love all through life. That's a case that I've seen that's it's very hard to then help those people understand that love is not available there. And it's as though I'm not going to ever take any love unless I get that love. That problem is something I see a lot. With the man, as I say, often what you see is a man who, unbeknownst to himself, truly deeply resents women, and in his relationships ends up punishing women. So how is that different from the abusive father or the narcissistic father? I would say that men with that narcissistic father, some of them identify with that father and are overtly abusive to their partners. Often daughters are, I don't know, again, it goes both ways. For some people, they become deeply self-alienated, deeply self-denigrating, self-loathing, and depressive. Other people identify with the aggressor.
Yeah. And I just wanted to note for listeners too, as it was coming out of my mouth, I realized, like, Sarah, don't be so heteronormative and assume that all families are constructed with male and female partners. So I just wanted to note that for the audience.
No, and that's something important to note. And I try in my writing and when I speak, I try to avoid assumptions like that because there are narcissistic dynamics available to all genders in all configurations.
Absolutely.
Unfortunately, it's definitely not, it's pretty gender blind in that way.
Yeah, absolutely. One other thing that you talk about a lot in the book that we talk about a lot in NARM is this being an object of the narcissist. And that's something that in my own work with NARM has been so revolutionary for me to understand how not only was I the object for my parents, but then objectifying myself. So I'm curious if you want to elaborate on that objectification.
Yeah, that's a huge piece of it. The traumatizing narcissist needs the person to depend on them because the only way they have of relating is through exploitation. If I am in relationship with you, it's because I'm going to take whatever I can from you. That's what the traumatizing narcissist is doing. And what they're good at is grooming people to make themselves exactly what the narcissist wants them to be. You certainly see this in cults where the cult leader is setting a model and everybody is trying to emulate it and be what's going to make the cult leader happy and not be what's going to make them mad. And, the cult leader is constantly moving the goalposts. So everybody's always unstable about, who am I supposed to be now? How do I be a person you're not going to yell at and not going to banish from the community? So that self-objectification is another way of surviving being in this kind of relationship. If I can objectify myself enough, you won't punish me as much. You won't humiliate. You won't belittle. You won't hurt me as much. I'll be the apple of your eye. Maybe I'll have a moment or two where I'm on a pedestal, and then you won't kick me off as often. If I can objectify myself so that I'm just the kind of object that you want me to be. That is a hallmark of the traumatizing narcissists, and it is one of the most traumatic things that people have to recover from, is having been led to believe that their only value as a human being is if they are the right kind of object for the other person.
Right.
That's dehumanization.
Yeah.
And I guess I want to say that's the cruelest aspect, I think, of the traumatizing narcissist.
Well, we've talked a lot about the difficulties of this population, but I'm curious if you have some success stories that you'd be willing to share with us.
I do, and I have some people who I worked with for a number of years who little by little became able to understand that, they had a self of their own that they could rely on, that felt that their subjectivity did not need to be judged or condemned or criticized, that they could come to experience themselves as a subjective person with desire and agency without judgment, without judging themselves, but just understanding themselves. So I would say the biggest successes, and not to give like a clinical vignette, there are many in my book, and I have a book that will be coming out next year with further examples of this. But when that's occurring, when the person is very able to and willing and desiring to be self-reflective without judgment, but with compassionate understanding, that's when I see the success. That's where I know this person has begun to value and respect themselves and care about what's going on inside of them and be interested and curious about it in order to make sense of it. That's what gets taken away in these traumatizing relationships. And when that comes back, that person has the skills and the tools to just, for the rest of their lives, make sense of what's going on inside, understand, know, act from a place of authentic subjectivity.
Yeah.
That's the real success, I find.
Yeah, and I love that you said the word curiosity, because in NARM we think of that as the antidote to self-hate.
Absolutely. But that curiosity, I find I can start helping a person develop that self-reflective curiosity. And often what I run up against is, okay, well, I see why I did that because I was triggered by this. And wow, what a stupid idiot I am.
That's not very curious.
So I'll point out, okay, you started out trying to make sense of what was going on inside, and you ended up right back at self-denigration.
Right.
And when that's the answer to all of your self-inquiry, you have a ways to go. We've got to find a way past the answer to everything being self-denigration. And when people can start to do that, really look inside and see why they felt ashamed or why they felt afraid and what happened and what triggered it and what they did as a result. And they can see that without judgment, without self-denigration, but with compassion. And then they develop that habit. That's really the road to recovery.
Yeah. And I'm curious, I haven't finished the book yet, but I noticed that the last chapter, I'm flipping through here, and I think this is really important. The last chapter called Analytic Love Revisited. I'm
Mm.
curious how the compassionate space that you hold as a therapist relates to recovery from this traumatic narcissism.
Right. Well, when I first started my psychoanalytic training, that subject became very meaningful to me. I was newly married and I had my first child while I was in training. And my own birth experience was traumatic in many ways. And, I don't blame anybody. There were circumstances that made it pretty traumatic for my mother, for my father, for myself. So when my child was born, I was very aware of the desire to create an environment of unconditional love that was just going to be unmistakable. Now it's easier said than done because
Life happens.
being an exhausted parent who hasn't slept, and you can start to see why people have trouble with babies. But overall, my experience was just so meaningful to me with both my children. And I began to think about all the patients that I was seeing in my therapy practice who hadn't had that chance to know that kind of unconditional love from the get-go. And I realized that a lot of what the work I was doing with people was basically trying to develop a relationship between us where they felt that they could fully trust that I was in their corner, that I was really there not to control them or exploit them or direct them, but to be fully attuned as much as possible and empathetic. And if they could experience me in that way, that would be like an analog to the experience of unconditional love. And they could begin to feel it for themselves. And so that was my thinking around analytic love. And it stemmed from the work of Sandor Ferenczi, who really presented an alternate psychoanalysis to the one that Freud did, and who I really became very deeply connected with in terms of his teachings, his writings. So analytic love was important to me from the get-go. And over time, I've thought about it more and more. What is the stance of the therapist? How are we with our patients? And it's not about being kind of overly kind and nice, but it's about being fully present to the other person and really, in a way, checking my own narcissism. Do I need you to get better to make me feel good?
Yes.
Do I, do I need you to like me to make me feel like a good therapist? I've got to know about those narcissistic tendencies in me. And if I can really stay on top of it with somebody, I'm providing an environment that is safe and secure and in which that person can grow. So to me, that's the nature of analytic love. Always working as much as possible for the patient's safety, for attunement and empathy, and for authenticity. And, that means allowing the patient's anger, understanding it, recognizing it. When you're a parent and your kids want to start developing their individuality and they want to express their anger, you can shut them down. Or you can appreciate that this is part of their development. And you can hold your love even when they're cursing you out and doing things they shouldn't be doing. And you don't withdraw and withhold love in those circumstances. And similarly, in therapy with very traumatized people I expect there's going to be a wide range of emotional experiences that we're going to go through. And that if my analytic love is steady and I'm holding steady, that we'll get through it. And we'll get to that other place where that person really feels they can trust me and they can trust themselves.
And when you talk about, recognizing your own narcissism and how that can then spill onto the client, that's exactly what we focus a lot of time on in NARM is recognizing how we are essentially bringing our stuff into the therapy room and coloring it in unfortunate ways. And this weekend in particular was really all about looking at our own narcissism. So I appreciate that lens.
Yeah, it's an unfortunate thing that I see a lot of people who come to me from very bad therapy experiences.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And, and they come to me because they've read my book or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And they, I speak in my book about the ways in which therapists can be harmful in terms of narcissism,
right?
Or the way therapy training can be harmful in terms of, trainers who are narcissistic.
Mm-hmm.
So that awareness is important in working with traumatized people. They don't want to be gaslighted.
Right.
They don't want to be mystified and they don't want to be controlled or exploited. And we have to be the guardians of that.
Yeah. Well, we're coming to the end of the hour, so I wanted to see if there's anything that we didn't talk about today that you really want to make sure you say to listeners.
Well, thank you. I think because I'm just about finishing up my second book, that I kind of have the important themes in mind. And I think I was able to touch on them, the recognition of self-alienation and how important that is to work through, and how important the development of compassionate self-reflection is. Those are the things that I have come to emphasize very strongly in my work with traumatized people. And that comes out of the advanced trainings that I took after my psychoanalytic training in the traumatology world.
Yep.
So I'm very grateful to traumatologists who have been so effective and so really brilliant in the way of understanding trauma and dissociation. It's made a huge difference in my work.
And I'm hopeful, and NARM really wants to be part of the movement of making all education more trauma informed, especially for psychotherapists. Because as you said, in the 90s, it was barely a thing. And now it's still, I teach in a couple universities for social workers, and there's one class on trauma. So I appreciate your contribution to the field and your, reflective of yourself and what you're bringing to the work. So thank you so much.
Thank you. And I appreciate you and NARM doing the work you're doing. It's so important and it's great work. Congratulations.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much for joining us for today's episode. If you want to learn more, you can check out the show notes or visit us at www.narmtraining.com/transformingtrauma. The NARM Training Institute has a very special announcement. We are offering the Level 2 NARM Therapist Training online for the very first time. The trauma field is evolving so quickly. Trauma-informed therapists who want to learn how to address the long-term impacts of adverse childhood experiences and complex post-traumatic stress disorder want to be trained in NARM, one of the first clinical models specifically designed to address ACEs and CPTSD. This online NARM therapist training is starting in January 2021 and is filling up fast. So if you're interested, we'd encourage you to register now to reserve your spot. Please visit www.narmtraining.com/level2online. That's www.narm-training.com/level2online. Thanks to Andrea Klunder and the Creative Imposter Studios for producing and editing, to Tori Essex for our album art, and to Brad Kammer for the creation of this podcast. We really look forward to building community and connection with you and changing the world by transforming trauma.